A 21-year-old just walked onto center court at Wimbledon and did something no Filipino tennis player, man or woman, has done since before her own grandparents were born. And the scoreline that got her there is so brutal, so specific, that even the woman she beat couldn't explain it afterward. Here's what nobody's telling you in the highlight clips. This wasn't one lucky match. This was 4 matches in a row, each one harder than the last, against an opponent who had just beaten a 7-time Grand Slam champion, then against the defending Wimbledon champion herself. And by the end of it, the story didn't end the way anyone expected. Stay with me, because the final twist of this run happened only yesterday, and it changes how this entire story should be told. Before we get into it, if you want the full breakdown of how a player ranked 140th in the world 1 year ago ended up on center court beating a Grand Slam champion, hit subscribe now, because we're about to walk through every round. Start with the small detail everyone noticed, but nobody explained properly. Alexandra Eala walked out for her matches at Wimbledon this year with a line of Tagalog stitched into the back of her visor. 6 words. Translated, they read, "Once it grows, it cannot be stopped." She had the sampaguita, the Philippine national flower, worked into the design too, the same flower she'd worn in her hair the year before. She's talked before about wanting to carry pieces of her culture onto the court, not as decoration, but as something closer to armor. It's a small detail. But by the end of this run, it stopped sounding like a slogan and started sounding like a description of what actually happened. To understand how big this moment was, you need to understand where the ceiling used to sit. 1 year before this, Wimbledon, Alexandra Eala was ranked 140th in the world. Not top 100. Not seeded anywhere. Just another name on tour. 12 months later, she walked into Wimbledon 2026, seeded 29th, her first Grand Slam ever as a seeded player. That's not a lucky week. That's 100+ ranking spots climbed in a single year, built on a breakout stretch that included her first tour-level title on grass at the Birmingham Open in June, a run to the semifinals of the Berlin Open, and a career-high ranking of 29 back in March after a strong showing at Indian Wells. But here's the part the highlight reels leave out. The run into Wimbledon wasn't clean. Just months earlier, in January, Eala walked into the Australian Open, her home continent's Grand Slam, in front of a stadium full of her own fans. And she started that match on fire. She won the first set 6-0, a bagel, against Alicia Parks of the United States. Everyone in that building thought they were about to watch a statement win. Then it fell apart. Parks steadied, found her serve, and took the next 2 sets, 6-3 and 6-2, to send Eala out in the first round for the 3rd time in her Grand Slam career. Eala had given a bagel, and then watched the match slip away anyway. That's the real shape of the doubt that followed her into the season. Not can she win a set. She could obviously do that. The question was whether she could close. Keep that in your head, because it comes back later. And it comes back in a way that actually answers the question properly, not the way you might expect. Wimbledon began quietly. Eala opened against Mexico's Renata Zarazúa and won it in straight sets, 6-1, 6-2, without dropping her own serve once. It wasn't the kind of match that makes headlines, but it did make history on its own. It was the first Grand Slam main draw win for a Filipino player at Wimbledon specifically. Quiet, efficient, economical tennis. The kind of win that doesn't look like drama until you realize what round 2 was about to throw at her. This is where the story actually starts moving. Eala's second-round opponent was Maya Joint of Australia, and Joint didn't arrive at that match as some underdog. 2 days earlier, Joint had knocked out Serena Williams in 3 sets, becoming the biggest name of that entire round of the tournament. She walked onto court, unseeded, ranked 87th, but carrying the kind of momentum that makes players dangerous. And there was history here too. Eala and Joint had met once before, in the final of the Eastbourne Open the year before, and Joint had won that one in 3 brutal sets. Eala later admitted that loss had genuinely hurt. She said she couldn't watch the highlights for months afterward, so this wasn't a comfortable draw. This was the hardest possible version of round 2. Joint came out fast, breaking Eala early and cruising to a 6-3 first set. For a while, the story looked like it was writing itself the wrong way. Then, something shifted. Eala took the second set 6-2, tightening her return game, cutting down her own errors, playing with more control point to point. And then in the deciding set, against the woman who had just eliminated a 7-time major champion, Eala did something that a young player still being asked whether she could close a slam had to do exactly once for the conversation to change. She won it 6-0. A bagel. In the decider. On the grass at Wimbledon. Against the player nobody wanted to face that day. The match lasted just under 2 hours. Eala said afterward that she genuinely had to dig deep, especially after that rough first set. She'd watched Joint's win over Serena and knew she was walking into a real fight. Remember the Australian Open? The bagel she gave away and then lost anyway? This time it held. She was the one still standing when the 6th game ended. And there was something else happening around that match that's easy to miss in the score alone. A section of Wimbledon's crowd, on what should have been a routine Thursday afternoon second-round match, had become almost entirely Filipino. Eala said she hadn't expected that kind of home crowd energy in England of all places. That crowd didn't show up by accident. It showed up because of what came next. Now, before we go further, there's a claim that's been floating around online about this run, and it's worth correcting properly, because the real history here is actually more interesting than the exaggerated version. The exaggerated version says no Filipino tennis player, man or woman, had ever reached the 3rd round of any Grand Slam before Eala did it this year. That's not quite right, and the real story deserves better than a made-up record. Back in the 1950s, a Filipino player named Felicissimo Ampon, nicknamed Mighty Might, barely 5 feet tall, reached the quarterfinals of the French Open at Roland Garros, not once but twice, in 1952 and 1953. He also reached the 3rd round of Wimbledon itself 3 separate times in that same era. For decades, Ampon was the high watermark of Philippine tennis, beating legends of his day, despite giving away inches to nearly every opponent he faced. What Eala actually did, and this is the accurate, verified version, is become the first Filipina in Wimbledon's Open era to reach the 3rd round of the tournament. Not first Filipino ever, full stop. First Filipina at this specific tournament, in this specific era. And as you're about to see, what happened in the very next round pushed her into territory that genuinely had never been reached before by anyone from her country. That's the more accurate, and honestly more satisfying, way to tell this story. The ceiling wasn't imaginary. It was real. It was set decades ago by a 5-foot-tall trailblazer most casual fans have never heard of, and Eala didn't just match it. She walked past it. Round 3 is where this stopped being a nice story and became a genuinely seismic result. Waiting for Eala was Iga Świątek, the defending Wimbledon champion, a 6-time Grand Slam winner, the no 3 seed in the draw. This wasn't a rebuilding contender. This was one of the most accomplished players of her generation, playing on the court where she'd lifted the trophy 12 months earlier. Eala and Świątek had history of their own. Back in 2025, as a 140th ranked wildcard, Eala had beaten Świątek at the Miami Open in one of the most talked-about upsets of that season. Świątek got her revenge a month later in Madrid. Coming into Wimbledon, their head-to-head sat at 1 win apiece. The first set alone became an instant classic, an hour and 24 minutes long, decided only in a tiebreak that stretched all the way to 9-9 before Eala finally closed it out 7-6. Świątek had chances. She served for the set. She fought off match points in the breaker. But Eala kept finding a way back, break for break, until she finally sealed it on her 4th set point when Świątek mishit a forehand long. After that marathon opening set, Eala didn't fade. She surged. She broke Świątek's serve to open the 2nd set, broke again to go up 3-0, and closed it out 6-2, finishing the match having broken the defending champion's serve 5 separate times. When it ended, Eala dropped to her knees in tears on center court. In her on-court interview, visibly emotional, She said that for a player like Świątek, someone who's already won so many Grand Slam titles, a win like this might not look like much. But for a kid who grew up in the Philippines training with her brother and grandfather after school, it meant everything. Let that sink in for a second. This wasn't just a good week. This was the biggest win of her career against the reigning champion on the tournament's biggest court. And it put her into the fourth round of a Grand Slam for the first time in her life. No Filipino player, man or woman, had ever reached the second week of a major in the Open era before that moment. Not Ampon in the amateur era of the 50s. That record belonged to a completely different chapter of tennis history. This was the actual, verified first. Here's the part of this story that the internet hasn't fully caught up with yet, because it happened only a day before this video went up. Eala's reward for beating the defending champion was a fourth-round match against Jasmine Paolini of Italy, a two-time Grand Slam finalist, a former world four, and someone who had already reached a Wimbledon final of her own 2 years earlier. Eala had actually beaten Paolini in straight sets back in February at the Dubai Championships. This was a rematch with the head-to-head sitting in her favor. It didn't go her way this time. Paolini broke early, took the first set 6-4. Eala answered, leveling things up with a 6-4 set of her own, forcing a decider in front of a crowd that included tennis royalty watching from the stands. But in the third set, Paolini found the break she needed at 4-3 and closed it out 6-3, ending Eala's run in a match that lasted just over 2 hours. So no, this story doesn't end with a trophy. It ends with a fourth-round loss. And normally, that's where a highlight video would quietly stop talking about it. But that's exactly the wrong way to read what actually happened here. Walk back through what this run actually contained. A first Grand Slam main draw win at Wimbledon. A comeback bagel against the woman who just eliminated Serena Williams. The single biggest win of her career against a defending Grand Slam champion on center court in an 84-minute opening set battle that will get replayed for years. And a fourth-round finish that made her the first player from the Philippines, man or woman, to reach the second week of a major in the Open era. That is not a story about a loss. That's a story about a ceiling that existed for 70-plus years, that one player from a country of over 100 million people, with almost no tennis infrastructure behind her, just walked straight through. Zoom out for a second. A year ago, this player was ranked 140th in the world and had lost 4 of her first 6 Grand Slam main draws. In January, she was still being asked, gently, whether she could actually close matches at the biggest level. A question that had a real, painful data point behind it from Melbourne. By July, she'd beaten a defending Wimbledon champion in one of the matches of the tournament, and reached further into a major than any player from her country ever had. The mentors who built her game at the academy she's trained at since her early teens weren't shocked by any of this. If you go back and look, they'd been framing her Wimbledon debut as a story worth telling before she'd won a single match there. When she started winning, the framing didn't need adjusting. It just aged well. That's usually what real development looks like from the inside. Not shock, recognition. She's 21 years old. She just went from a first-round exit in January to the second week of Wimbledon in July. And the line stitched into the back of her visor doesn't read like a slogan anymore. It reads like a diagnosis that turned out to be accurate. Here's the question nobody can answer yet. Not the pundits, not her academy, not even Eala herself. She's shown she can beat a defending champion on the sport's biggest stage. She's shown the run has real limits too, when a 2-time finalist plays her best tennis for 2 hours straight. The next Grand Slam is only weeks away. Does this become the new normal for her? Or was this one perfect, unrepeatable stretch of grass court magic? We won't know until the next major starts. That's exactly why you'll want to be here when it does. If you want to be here for the next chapter of this story, subscribe, hit the bell, and drop a comment telling us the moment you first heard the name Alexandra Eala. We read every one of them.